Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by Kevin Williamson. He is a roving reporter for the National Review Online and author of multiple books. And Kevin, we're glad to have you on the show this evening.
Thanks.
So tell us, how did you first enter the world of journalism? What drew you?
Well, I had no marketable skills, so journalism is sort of a good place to go if you don't have a lot of useful skills. You can write about people who have useful skills and are doing things. So, writing is really all I've ever done for a living. I guess when I was a kid, I worked at Burger King for a while and 7-Eleven after that, but the only real job I've ever had was journalism. So I started it when I was in junior high and high school and school newspapers and all that. I went to the University of Texas, which at the time had an enormous daily student newspaper, still a pretty big newspaper, not nearly as big as it was. Like all newspapers, it's gone through some difficult times in the age of the internet and all that. And then I moved to India directly after college, where I worked for a newspaper there, the Indian Express, in Bombay at first, and then Delhi, and a few other places. And that's really all I've done for a long time. I was editor of a couple of newspapers. Because I'm a financial genius, I helped start a daily newspaper in Philadelphia in around 2004, I guess it was, which ran for a few years. It was actually a lot of fun to do, but it was not really the world's best business proposal, starting a new daily newspaper in the thriving city of Philadelphia from a conservative perspective, nonetheless. But the 11 Republicans in Philadelphia really liked my newspaper, and they all read it every day.
Yeah, the circulation, and then the rest of them are buying it for litter box liners, etc.
Well, I think we were actually the first newspaper in the United States to have a Sudoku puzzle, because the publisher's wife was really into that. And we had some other good stuff in the paper. So it wasn't just, right-winger. It was a very conservative op-ed page. But the theory was at the time that, Philadelphia didn't have a good newspaper. The Inquirer's terrible. The Daily News was in decline. And you go to, Starbucks around Philadelphia and in the suburbs in places like Lower Merion, these very wealthy, affluent, educated places around Philadelphia, and everyone's reading the New York Times. And they're reading it for, the international coverage, for the arts and culture stuff, the book review, and all that. So our idea was to bring that kind of content, but done locally there in Philadelphia. Terrible idea, as it turns out, but it was meant well.
And then from there,
well, naturally, all followed there was unemployment.
Okay.
for a period, and. So I actually ended up back in my hometown for a little while, working at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, where I'd started my career many years ago. And I was working as a copy editor. I just, needed a job to fill the time. So I was trying not to be a pain in the ass is what I was doing, because, I had been editor-in-chief of a couple of newspapers, and I had, worked for and done writing at much bigger and more prestigious outlets than the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, which is not a bad newspaper. But so that was humbling, but in a good way. I also worked in a warehouse during that time, and for a big evil corporation that shall not be named, which paid me quite a bit more, of course, than the newspaper did.
Working in a warehouse is more than journalists.
Oh, God, yes, a lot more, for moving boxes around and stuff. So after that, I went to work for a wonderful organization called the Institute for Humane Studies, which is at George Mason University, there outside Washington, D.C., where I ran an educational program for student journalists and people going into media. And one of my jobs there was to help conservative and libertarian organizations that were looking for people to staff openings they had. National Review came around one day looking for someone, and I chained my way into the job. I told them I'd find someone and recommended myself. I'd actually applied for a job at National Review when I was about 17, I want to say. I was in high school in Lubbock, and I was trying to decide whether to go to University of Texas or go to Yale. And Yale was very expensive, of course. And at the time, it was only $25,000 a year, but that seemed like a lot of money. And so $100,000 to get an English degree, which is really hard to think through. My household income at that time, between both my parents, probably wasn't $30,000. So I wrote a letter to Bill Buckley. I was a National Review reader already at that point, and offering my services. I knew he commuted back and forth between Connecticut and New York. I figured maybe I would do sort of a Man Friday kind of thing for him. So I got a really nice letter back from Bill, and then one from John O'Sullivan, who was the editor at the time, saying that in spite of the fact that I was the editor of the Lubbock High School newspaper, they were not currently in need of my services, but keep them in mind. So 20-odd years later, I ended up going to work for them finally. Did
you resubmit the original application and the
No, but I've still
letter?
got the letters at home somewhere. I've still got those. It's funny. I didn't know Bill Buckley well, but I had dinner with him at an editorial meeting. It turned out to be the last National Review editorial dinner at Bill's house before he passed away. And I didn't know this at the time, but his father had been the first editor of the University of Texas yearbook, The Cactus, William F. Buckley Sr. So I went back and did a little research on his dad, and it turns out he had a great deal of involvement. So there was kind of a sort of a pre-National Review Buckley angle there to UT. So I didn't end up at Yale, where Bill wrote the book about. So I guess one of these days I can write God and Man at UT, but I don't think there'll be much to say.
But you did end up at the National Review.
I did, ultimately, yeah.
Yeah, so there that was. And so when did you get bit by the bug to do other things like write the books?
Oh, well, there's money, of course. It was spurs you to do work and such. No, I've written really all my life. I'm a little bit of an obsessive compulsive writer. So the first book I did was the socialism book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, that I published with Regnery as part of their Politically Incorrect Guide series. And so they called me up and asked me if I was interested in doing a book on socialism, and basically I'd already written the book. So I very gratefully accepted their money and sent them a manuscript about, 5 weeks later, something like that. Turned around pretty quickly. And so I've written a number of small books, one about Detroit called What Doomed Detroit, the sort of horrible politics and decision-making that turned what had been the United States' highest income city to the mess of despair that it is now.
Have you noticed a trend in that general regard?
Cities under monopoly Democratic government, tend to do pretty poorly. So I was in Philadelphia for a long time. You got a really good bird's eye, or first-person view of that. Philly's really interesting because there's a street in Philadelphia called City Avenue. So on one side of City Avenue is West Philadelphia, which is quite poor and has terrible schools, lots of crime, things like that. Literally across the street is Lower Merion, and Lower Merion is one of the wealthiest places in the United States. I lived within view of the polo field. Lower Merion is a place where people, where steeplechase racing is a big pastime. People own, steeplechase horses and things. My newspaper there, I was the editor of the local newspaper. Most newspapers do like a booth at the county fair or something. Ours was a tent at the Radnor Hunt races, which is part of the steeplechase Triple Crown. So different sort of thing. Our biggest advertiser was a jeweler.
Yeah, well, still tent-oriented, it sounds like.
Yeah, but what's interesting, though, is if you look at things like the schools, Lower Merion on one side of the street and Philadelphia on the other side of the street spend about the same amount of money per student. It's not radically different, but they get much different results. They spend, proportionally about the same on things like law enforcement and other public services, but they get really very different results. So it's an interesting case study, I think, where you've got these two radically different communities that aren't separated by, miles of interstate the way they would be in a place like Texas.
100 feet.
Not even that. Not even that. They're literally cheek by jowl. I guess not literally cheek by jowl. Sorry, that was a Joe Biden literally. A literally that doesn't mean literal.
And so, but you've got other books such as The End is Near, and it's going to be awesome.
That's true.
Do you cover that type of a topic as well? It's
funny. I write a lot about economics, and I don't really have much of a background formally in economics. I was for a little while an economics major in school until one of my professors explained to me that I shouldn't be an economics major because I wasn't good enough at math. And so I joke about my English major math. But what I ended up doing was it was during the financial crisis and the bailouts and all that stuff. And I was arguing with Rich Lowry at National Review and some other people about the magazine's position on that, which was, tepidly and with reservations to some extent in favor of TARP and the other interventions. For, I actually think, pretty defensible reasons. Their argument at the time was that you're either going to get this or you're going to get a bailout designed by Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama a few months later, and this is better than that. So
lesser of the evils, so just go with it.
Yeah. So I was arguing with Rich about this, and eventually he just said, well, if you're so interested in this, why don't you start producing me some copy on the subject? So I started writing a lot about that. And I've always been interested in the national debt and the unfunded liabilities and things like that. That's something I wrote about for years before I got to National Review, just because I think it's a very worrisome subject and something that people don't really understand that well, which I think has something to do with an inability to conceptualize very large numbers.
Right.
So you can tell someone something is 10 million, 10 billion, 10 trillion, and it all sounds the same to people.
Right.
They don't really think about it that much. So I wanted to try to get to the point, and that's part of what the end is near is about, is trying to explain to people just what the real scale of this financial issue is, and the way it's going to affect lives in real terms in the future.
Well, especially when you've already seen situations up close and personally where literally less than 100 feet away, the same amount of money is getting dramatically different results, and you're watching all of the money be frittered away.
Yeah.
And asking yourself, is it worth it in the first place, or are there more efficient ways to do things? And it's done at that scale. Yeah,
and it's not just efficiency. We conservatives and libertarians and free market types tend to think in those terms a lot. About price and waste and those sorts of things. And those things are all expensive, but all relevant. But expense isn't really the only question. There are I think some deeper issues about how we go about helping people to achieve the things that they really want to achieve in life.
Wait, help and achieve things that we're trying to achieve? That means there was a goal there in the first place, and that's almost like accountability might be required.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's very difficult for people to understand is that not everyone has the same goals. And when you have these kind of monopoly systems, these big monopolies, things like the public school monopolies or Social Security or Medicare, now the Affordable Care Act regime, you can't deal with all the different sets of goals that people have. You have to narrow them down and say, well, we're going to have 5 different Obamacare plans, or 15, or whatever the number is. Whatever number you come up with isn't going to be a big enough number because there's just too much diversity and complexity in a population of 318 million people. It's just never going to work out that way. So it's beyond the question of just expense, and it's also about the issue of opportunity cost, which is the thing that people really overlook. So if you look at all the waste of something like, say, Medicare or the federal highway system, which is just a disaster. I'm a big Eisenhower fan, but that was a mistake. The problem isn't just the money you spend on those things, it's what you've lost by virtue of the fact that money didn't go to more useful purposes somewhere else. So, the original investment that turned Apple from a project to a real company was $250,000. Capital in the hands of the right people at the right time can really make enormous differences in the world. The original investment in Google was $100,000. On Ford Motor Company was $28,000, which if you adjust for inflation, maybe $600,000 in contemporary dollars. So the relatively small amounts of money that really didn't just change the world in terms of, well, now we got cars and computers and other sorts of cool stuff, but it really changed the way people live and work and make other decisions down the road and communicate and interact with one another. So every time you're spending $1 trillion out the door on Medicare, something that doesn't work, you are potentially preventing, thousands of these new things from coming. So it's a difficult idea to communicate to people because the cost isn't the thing you see on the ledger. The cost is the thing you don't see, the things that you would have had if this capital had been allowed to do what capital is supposed to do. Yeah,
but at the levels that you're talking about, $100,000, $28,000, how are you supposed to feed all of your cronies as a budding politician if you're just giving out those little trinkets of funds?
Well, yeah, they can always steal. Traditionally that was the model, is that they would steal. And, in some ways that was a better model because the total sums involved were relatively small. If you're Al Gore and you want to enrich all of your green energy cronies through tax credits and grants and various kinds of subsidies, that's a pretty big scale of operation. Whereas if you're, some ward healer in, South Philadelphia in 1964, it's a couple $1,000 here or there, right? No one really misses that so much.
Good times, good times.
So I'm a conservative in the sense I'm a fan of old-fashioned corruption more than the new kind of corruption.
Well, you make the criminals work for it a little harder, as I think.
Work for it, yeah.
Because work ethic is important.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to just handing it to them. Full Sail. So you've also covered some other things that we talked about. One of your other books is The Case Against Trump.
Yeah, it's my most recent one. So a little small book. Encounter publishes this wonderful series of books called Broadsides. So the little books, little paperbacks that you can read in a single setting. And I've written a few of those. And the most recent one is The Case Against Trump. And it was funny when I was talking with Roger Kimball, the publisher of Encounter Books, about the idea for the project. He wasn't sure he wanted me to do it because, surely Trump won't be in the race that long. This is going to be one of those weird media celebrity flash in the pan things, and he'll go away. But we'll go ahead and bring the book out anyway, and just in case. And so that SOB is still in the running, as it turns out.
It almost sounds like you have an opinion.
Yeah, I think he's a lowlife. I think he's a genuine menace to the Republic.
And so, I mean, top 3 reasons in your case against Trump.
Well, he's a person of low character. I mean, that's a real problem. I'm not, sort of a Pollyanna-ish person about politics. I mean, you need, some rat bastards from time to time. A lot of bad things were done in the course of doing things like defeating Adolf Hitler.
Right.
A lot of strong arming had to be done in the course of things like achieving civil rights for African Americans. Eisenhower sent troops into an American city to get that done. So, I think I have a fairly realistic attitude about those things. But when you have someone like Trump who is such a habitual liar, so instinctively dishonest, a man who, lies almost every time he opens his mouth. He lies about self-funding his campaign. This week he was lying about owning the hotel in Honolulu. You see this thing where he was talking about, he's going to Hawaii, I guess they're having a caucus out there, and I employ a lot of people in Hawaii in my hotel there, and blah, blah. He doesn't actually own the Trump hotel there. It's just one of those things that's licensed and uses his name. And he tells these lies in public as though he doesn't expect to be challenged on them. And what's amazing is that he so infrequently is. I was listening to CNN earlier today, and they were talking about Trump self-funding his campaign, which just isn't true. He just simply isn't doing that, but he keeps saying it, and people keep repeating it as though it were the case. So, he's obviously treated his business partners and various wives and family and such things in a pretty poor way. And that kind of, instinctual dishonesty, as opposed to the occasional episode of operational dishonesty, which one expects in a politician, I think is worrisome. So that's the first thing, maybe more length than you wanted. Secondly, he's very incurious about the world. I was shocked in the debates to learn that he doesn't know how a bill becomes a law. So he missed that Schoolhouse Rock, on a bill sitting on the hill.
It's still available on YouTube.
It is on YouTube. In fact, I tweeted that at him to help him along in his presidential campaign. So here's a guy who wants to be president, doesn't know how a bill becomes a law, and doesn't really seem to know how the government works, what the president does, what he can and can't do. So that's worrisome. And the third thing that's, he's not terribly bright. He's, a fairly mediocre mind, which in his case is combined with this great insecurity about himself and this need to prove himself and to be this, tough guy that he portrays on television. He's a game show host, for God's sake. The guy's a game show host. But the character he plays on television is what he really wants to be. And so you find him doing things like, well, I'll order the military to commit various kinds of war crimes and murder people's families and torture people and that sort of thing. And that's a really very dangerous thing to have in someone like him.
Or like the president.
Or someone with nuclear codes, yeah, sure, that would be worrisome.
So you've had time to spend on the campaign trail with him and with some of the other candidates.
Yeah, Sanders and Hillary and a few of the others. And
so, insight that you've gleaned, what happens when these folks are off camera? Who's really themselves, regardless of who's around, who's not, and who actually doesn't get a fair shake on the camera versus the person they are behind the scenes? Yeah,
with Trump I can't speak to on that front, just I've never been in a private setting with Trump. Bernie Sanders is a lunatic, but he's the genuine article off camera when he's in small groups of people or walking around. Just kind of, I was with him in Iowa and was watching him talk to people on sidewalks. This is before his campaign really took off. Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders all the time, And he should be kept far from the levers of power. And he shouldn't even be in the Senate or the House. And really, he shouldn't have been mayor of Burlington for that much. But he is genuinely who he is, which is a genuine 1970s fruitcake. But honestly, that. Hillary, again, I've not really been in private with her. She's a terrible campaigner, I think. She's a terrible public speaker. She's nothing like her husband. I know she doesn't like being compared with her husband, but I mean, let's face it, if it weren't for Bill Clinton, no one would know who Hillary Clinton is. She's a great feminist icon who has done nothing in her life but coast on the coattails of her husband, who mistreats her terribly, and is the classic patriarchal, abusive sort of guy. So, but she's this kind of hectoring way of talking, this sort of obvious kind of phoniness and shallowness about her that's worrisome.
Will she be in jail by the time the elections roll around?
God, I hope so, but I doubt it very much. We have a highly politicized Justice Department right now, and it's very difficult to see them doing that unless there's some, I don't want to play too much Obama White House criminology, but the Obama people do hate the Clintons.
Yes.
They hate them. And I don't think Barack Obama very much wants to turn his party and his movement over to Hillary Clinton here in a few months. But I don't think, it seems to me unlikely that he dislikes that idea enough to sabotage their prospects in the presidential election and hand the country over to Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. Cruz has a long relationship with National Review, and he's personally close to a number of people on our staff. I don't know him that well personally. Cruz, I've given a really hard time to in various ways. I'd be perfectly satisfied to see the man elected president, don't get me wrong. I think he's a very smart guy. His policies are essentially my policies. I think that he looked at the field and the campaign and the example of Donald Trump and decided that the Republican primary electorate were just morons. And so he had to go out and run a campaign for morons. And he's done that in many ways very successfully. I think the Ted Cruz you see on the campaign trail right now is not really very much like the actual Ted Cruz, who is kind of, professorial and thoughtful and likes to talk about John Rawls and that sort of thing.
Which will go right over the top of most folks.
Yeah. So, I'm not saying he's wrong about that calculation. Maybe he did need to run an imbecilic campaign for a party that's dominated by imbeciles at the primary level, or at least maybe a third of them are. So he's a very different sort of guy, I think, than his public persona. Rubio strikes me as being consistently Rubio. He has this thing he does where after he gives a speech, he'll go, walk past the donors and politicians and things and go to the back of the room and shake hands with, waiters and service people and things like that. But he also does that in places where there aren't cameras on him. I think that he is genuinely that way. Yeah.
But do you think he'll be lasting much longer?
It's hard to say. It's really strange. These things are, of course, inherently unpredictable. But the Republicans had such an embarrassment of riches this time around. You got guys like Rick Perry, who was probably the most successful governor in modern American history, and Bobby Jindal, who's a pretty good one too, and people like Rand Paul and all sorts of smart, interesting people, and good people in the race still, Cruz and Rubio and Kasich rather. But they've managed to just shoot themselves in an organ in which you don't want to be shot with this Trump thing. So they've taken what must have been one of the great layups in political history and are turning it into an own goal. Well,
love to learn more about what you're doing and get more of your opinions, but we're out of time for now. If people do want to look you up, where can they, is there a website they can go to find you?
Well, there's nationalreview.com.
Okay, so nationalreview.com is the best place to find thoughts from Kevin. Well, if we thank you for joining us. If you hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. We appreciate them tremendously because they've been underwriting the show for now. This is going into the 5th season. But what they're best known for is their speaker series. That was the reason we were fortunate to have Kevin with us this evening, is he'll be speaking at 7 o'clock at 432 Stearland Road, right here in Mountain View, a few minutes from the studio, at the Portuguese IFES Hall, where normally, as I said, the show starts at 7 o'clock. But in upcoming months, we have guests such as Pete Hegseth, who's a decorated soldier, Fox News Channel contributor, and will be representing the next generation of American leaders. John Eastman, faculty member of the Chapman University Law School and chairman of the board for the National Organization for Marriage, and others coming up in months ahead. If you'd like more information about the programs at the Conservative Forum, you can find that at theconservativeforum.com. And in closing tonight, I'd just like you to think a little bit more about the topics that Kevin covered, but also getting to know more about the candidates that are out in the world right now vying for your presidential vote, and get to know who they are on camera and off camera, as well as track Kevin down and find out more about the end of the world being near and it being awesome, and also the impolitically correct view of socialism. If you look at all of these things, I'm sure that there will be enlightenment for those of you who are on the conservative side, but also maybe some light bulbs going off for you that tend to lean in a more socialist direction. In closing, I'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening. This has been The Right Side. I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and I look forward to seeing you in person or on the show again sometime soon. But if you just can't wait, reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks, and have a great evening.